Alorena Ferinek. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today I want to talk about agility. And agility is one of those core competencies that you want when you're dealing with ambiguity, when you're dealing with the unknown. And so I did a video earlier this week around uncertainty, but I want to talk a little bit about our responsiveness to uncertainty. So ambiguity and how we respond when things do not go as planned. And so I think that there's so much in our lives that are bound to not go in alignment to plan, but it's not necessarily what happens that really makes or breaks the situation, because again, like life is much of life is beyond our realm of control. It's how we respond. And I think when we recognize the power of our response, we're much more mindful and intentional about how we allow ourselves to respond when things happen that we didn't expect to happen. And so I want to talk a little bit about ambiguity, because I think some people want to think that they have all of the pieces, that they know the full picture, but there's always going to be a certain degree of blind spots, right? Like there's always going to be an unknown factor. I think the best way to set yourself up for success is to take into consideration these unknown factors, recognizing that life is full of them. There's always going to be something that you didn't foresee, even if you're someone who is an overthinker like I am, who likes to catastrophize, who likes to think about like worst case scenarios so that I can be as prepared as possible. You're always going to find something that completely throws you off guard that you hadn't thought about, whether it's a person, whether it's a situation or a circumstance that really will stand to be a threat or a barrier to what it is that you're looking towards. So how do you address it? And I think that the first thing that I want to talk about here when we're dealing with ambiguity is I want to talk about the emotional experience around it. And I think that sometimes we like to skate over like the emotionality that can arise when we're uncertain, when we're unsure, or when something comes up or happens in our life that shows us that we put our confidence maybe in the wrong place, and that we are dealing with a very ambiguous setting and terrain, like we're navigating through a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns. That for some people can be really debilitating. And so what I've recognized is, even if there's something that I feel confident in, I know that that confidence could easily be misplaced. And so I am as confident as my situation or as the setting allows me to be, but I'm always ready and waiting for something to happen that will shift and change that confidence. And I talk a little bit about that in my first video around corroborated truths. And corroborated truths are truths that we recognize are the best truth that we have access to at this point in time. And so why is this helpful? It's helpful because typically when we hold something to be true, we hold it to be inherently true to such an extent that we build systems of beliefs around those truths. And so when we hold something to be a corroborated truth, so a truth that is conditional on certain factors, then we recognize that if any of those factors are questioned, then that truth itself is subject to change. And I think when we take that attitude, that change in and of itself is not something that we need a lot of time to bounce back from. It's not like we're reshaping our system of beliefs end to end because something happened that showed us that the truth that we believed in is untrue. And so this can happen in varying degrees. I think when we think about like how stressful it can be to have something that we thought was true proven false, think about like what you would feel and how jarring it would you would feel if you found out that you were adopted, right? So if you found out that you were adopted, it's like a fact that's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. But if you didn't know if it was kept from you, then finding that truth out, you're going to start to reshape and retag and sort of recognize that your memories and the way that you've form them are going to need to change. You're going to think about like your life, and you're going to feel like a lot of your life was based on a lie. Not necessarily so, because being adopted doesn't necessarily mean that your life experiences were false, but not having access to that truth, it changes something, right? And that can be very debilitating. Now, if you were raised with a suspicion that you might be adopted, then when you find out that you're adopted, it's not that debilitating because you had the suspicion from the beginning. And so that's the difference between holding something as absolutely true, so not thinking that you were adopted at all because that's what people told you, and holding something as conditionally true, whereas having the suspicion that you were adopted, so that if ever it does come out to light, it's not going to be something that really changes the way you see yourself, changes your sense of self-identity. It's just going to be something that you take in stride. And so think about that and then bring it to a less extreme degree, and just think about your day-to-day life. There are things that we do in life because we assume specific truths that don't necessarily need to be true. And I think that when we hold less less things than absolute truth. We give ourselves the ability to be nimble, to be agile, and to be responsive in a way that the environment, that the setting requires. And so there's a lot of things that can happen in a day-to-day that can really shift and change the trajectory that we're on. But maybe the trajectory shouldn't change, but we have to find ways to adapt and to hold space for the emotions that might create pivots in that trajectory. And so I think that it's really important that when we're caught off guard and we are faced with a truth that we didn't expect, that we still hold the line. We give ourselves the opportunity to have clarity, to ground ourselves, to find ourselves centered before we decide how we react or how we want to respond to that change. And so for that, I really do distinguish between reaction and being responsive. I think a reaction is like the gut instinct. It's just like your body's survival mode and whatever it feels it needs to do in that survival state. And that could be, having an angry reaction. It could be so many different things that don't actually ultimately help you long term, but make you feel like you're protecting yourself in the short term. So I think what I want for all of us to do is push beyond this need to have this like survival reaction for a moment. Give yourself the opportunity to be responsive. Give yourself the opportunity to be centered, to really think about the information that you've been provided and what it actually means, like what value it actually holds. Because sometimes we attribute much more value than what we need to specific things, and only when it's been brought to our attention do we have the opportunity to really recalibrate, reevaluate, and then decide our step forward. And I think responsiveness is just the best way of cultivating a sense of agility, because you take the new information, you hold space for your emotion, but then you decide, well, what's the best move for me? And I think that that's just something we don't think too much about. We think a lot about survival and how we protect ourselves. We don't necessarily think about like, what's the best move for me with this new information in mind, and how every new piece of information is feedback that gives you the opportunity to make more informed or to make better informed decisions for ourselves. And I think that if that's how we look at life and how we look at just things coming up out of this ambiguity, and like there's always a certain degree of ambiguity, right? Like even if there are things that we hear that give us confirmation, things that we see that give us confirmation, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty, of always going to be a certain blind spot that gives us a sense that like we can be like 90% confident, but there's always that 10% gap. And I think with everything that I have confidence in, I give myself like a 10% ambiguity margin for like, yeah, like I'm mostly confident about this, but like things are subject to change at any point. And I would much rather be prepared for change than to be unprepared for change and get caught off guard. And of course, we're going to get caught off guard regardless. But if I'm ready to get caught off guard, or if I'm priming myself to be caught off guard, then I'm not necessarily going to be as reactive as the situation might create. I can give myself the space to be responsive. And I think that responsiveness gives us an opportunity to be mindful about how we approach the situation. We can be intentional with our words. We can be clear about how the direction we're choosing and how the choices that we're making is going to impact us long term. I think that's just so important when we're dealing with ambiguity, because we don't want to deal with ambiguity by having like a knee-jerk reaction that ends up hurting us and hindering us in the long term. We want to deal with ambiguity in a way that's mature, that's calm, that's grounded, and that helps and that serves us ultimately. And I think that how we align ourselves to ambiguity will enable us to do those specific things. So this is going to be a short video, but it is a video around really how we create agility with ambiguity, how we can be more adaptable, especially when change is such a constant, especially in an increasingly globalized arena with so much that's happening around the world. I think all of us need to think about, well, how can we be more agile? Because news today can shift like 180 degrees tomorrow. And so how do we help ourselves be responsive and not feel paralyzed around the extremity of change that can happen on a day-to-day basis? How do we give ourselves the opportunity to adapt when things just are not at all in alignment with our expectations? Like one day to the next, like things could absolutely change. And so is that idea jarring to you? Does that make you feel like a deer caught in headlights? How do you reduce the effect of you feeling like a deer caught in headlights so that you can be responsive, you can be adaptive, you can be agile in how you address a situation that best serves you? And I think these are questions we all need to ask ourselves more often, especially with just about how the way the world is going. And like, I don't think we can change anything about the way the world is going. Like things are happening as they're supposed to happen. But as it starts to trickle down into each of our individual lives, we think to ourselves, well, how do I ensure that how I react to the things that are happening around me are going to be the things that best serve me? And the best way to address life in a way that best serves you is really confronting your attitudes, your beliefs, your values around ambiguity, and how you think to yourself, well, how do I create agility when I am dealt with situations that are super uncertain, where I'm super unsure, where I don't necessarily feel like I have the dexterity to really act from a place of mastery. Like, how do I ensure that I can adapt, right? I can adapt to what the situation is requiring of me. I don't let it be what destroys me ultimately, because nothing needs to destroy any of us, at least not permanently anyway. And how do I be responsive? How do I ensure that I'm aligned to my highest self in the way that I respond? How do I ensure that I protect my interests, that I protect myself in the way that I respond as well, without necessarily having a knee-jerk survival instinct versus reaction? Like, how do I keep myself grounded, 10 toes on the ground? So I want to have this conversation because I think it's an important conversation to have, just everything going around in the world. I think that ambiguity is just so much more prominent. And I don't know if we realize what extent, like, we're just so unsure about the future. And I don't think that that's necessarily a scary thing if we equip ourselves for radical shifts, radical changes in a short turnaround time. Like, before we were primed, we had warnings, we had different people who were really massaging that messaging for us so that we could take our time to digest it. And now, like, we don't necessarily have that courtesy, right? Like, things are just happening so quickly from one day to the next. And I think that if all of us are just more cognizant of the competencies that we need in the landscape that's this volatile, then we have the opportunity to still rise above it and to be on top of it at the end of the day. So that's what I wanted to come in here and talk about. It's some food for thought for you. Now, we do provide adult programs focusing on cultivating the self-mastery that will enable us to really find fulfillment and meaning in life, regardless of the phase and stage that we're currently experiencing. This is really cultivating a higher sense of focus, having that growth mindset, cultivating a value around development as well, and just that growth and just really focusing on that clarity, right? That clarity of thought, the clarity of mind, so that we're always living in alignment. And we also do provide parent-child workshops, so workshops for children, cultivating that leadership quotient. We think that you can never start too early. And so we believe that the leadership competency itself is built in 4 core abilities, and that's cultivating a sense of autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept. So something for everyone in your family. If you're still here, I will invite you to check out our website. We have the link here. Subscribe to our website, subscribe to our channel. Give us your feedback by way of what you think will enable someone to cultivate agility, be adaptive, and be responsive in the face of ambiguity. I think that these are conversations that really do need to be had online, so that we're all priming ourselves to equip ourselves to deal with this ever-shifting, changing, volatile landscape. Thank you again so much, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again very soon. We'll talk to you later.